Julian Cross should have stayed inside. The restaurant was warm, dimly lit, wrapped in polished wood and soft jazz that hummed just loud enough to drown out real conversation. Investors were still seated around the table, arguing about margins and projections that blurred together after a while. Julian had nodded, excused himself politely, and stepped out before dessert arrived. Outside, Chicago hit him all at once. Cold air. The kind that slid under your collar and settled there, refusing to move. The streets smelled like wet pavement and exhaust, and somewhere down the block a siren wailed, distant but insistent. Julian loosened his tie as he walked, letting his shoes carry him without direction. He didn't want the car yet. He didn't want another enclosed space filled with people pretending they weren't tired. He took a wrong turn without realizing it. The sidewalk narrowed. The glow of storefronts faded behind him. Suddenly he was between buildings, brick walls rising on both sides, dumpsters lined up like silent witnesses. This was the service alley the restaurants used. Crit. Trash bags. A few rats darting when his shoes scraped the ground. Julian slowed, annoyed with himself. He'd meant to clear his head, not wander into places his security team would lecture him about later. That's when he saw it. At first, it didn't register as a person. Just a dark shape near the far dumpster. Something low to the ground, wrapped in black plastic that fluttered slightly in the wind. He almost kept walking. Almost stepped past it the way he had stepped past dozens of other things in his life. Then the shape moved. Just a little. A tremor. A sound so faint it could have been the wind slipping through trash bags. But it wasn't. Julian stopped. His heart sped up, not out of fear but confusion. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing awkwardly off the walls. No answer. He took a few careful steps closer. The alley smelled stronger here. Rotting food. Damp cardboard. Something sour and metallic. He fought the instinct to wrinkle his nose. The shape was definitely a person now. Curled inward. Knees drawn tight to chest. Hands tucked under fabric like they were trying to preserve heat at all costs. Julian crouched, the cold seeping straight through his coat into his knees. "Ma'am?" he said again, softer this time. Nothing. For a brief, uncomfortable second, he wondered if she was already gone. He reached out, hesitated, then lightly touched the edge of a trash bag. It crinkled loudly in the quiet alley. The woman flinched. A sharp intake of breath. Her head shifted. Hair fell across her face in tangled strands. She made a sound, half cough, half sob, and tried to pull the bag tighter around herself. Julian leaned closer, and the security light above them flickered. The light hit her face, and everything inside him stopped. His mind rejected it first. Flat refusal. This didn't belong here. This woman didn't belong here. Not in an alley. Not like this. "No," he whispered before he realized he'd spoken. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. Then they settled on him. Recognition crept in, followed immediately by something else. Shame. She turned her face away. Julian felt like he'd been punched. "Renee," he said louder now. "Renee Brooks." She squeezed her eyes shut. Her shoulders shook once. When she spoke, her voice barely carried. "Please," she said. Just go." Julian stood abruptly, panic mixing with disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Renee had worked in his home for years. She was steady, reliable, quietly proud. The woman who always arrived early and left late. Who folded his shirts the same way every time. The woman he had helped. He crouched again, shrugging off his coat and draping it around her shoulders before she could protest. She stiffened but didn't push it away. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Renee, what happened?" She didn't answer. Her hands clutched the coat like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. His chest tightened. "Where's the apartment?" he asked, the question spilling out before he could soften it. "The place I gave you. You were safe. You were." Her breath hitched. "I lost it," she whispered. Julian stared at her. "You lost it?" He shook his head. "No, that doesn't make sense. I paid the rent. I made sure." "It wasn't mine," she said quietly. The alley seemed to close in around them. Julian looked down at her, realizing for the first time how small she looked. How tired. How cold. This wasn't just bad luck. This was something deeper. Something broken. If you've ever wondered how someone can fall so far without anyone noticing, stay with me. Sometimes the first mistake isn't cruelty. It's assuming help ends the story. Julian swallowed. You're not staying here, he said firmly. Not tonight. Renee finally looked at him again. Her eyes were glossy but sharp. Afraid. Guarded. You shouldn't have come this way, she said. And for reasons he couldn't explain yet, Julian had the chilling sense that she wasn't talking about the alley at all. Renee didn't move when Julian held out his hand. She stared at it like it belonged to someone else. Like it was a test she was too tired to pass. I'm fine, she said, though her teeth chattered as soon as the words left her mouth. The sound annoyed her. It betrayed her. Julian ignored the lie. He scanned the alley again, suddenly aware of how exposed it was. A delivery door slammed somewhere above them. A laugh drifted down from a kitchen window, careless and loud. Life continuing, completely unaware of what was happening 10 feet below. You're freezing, he said. Come on. Let me help you up. I said I'm fine. Her voice was firmer now, defensive. Renee shifted as if to prove it, but the moment she tried to straighten her legs, her body gave up on her. She sucked in a sharp breath and collapsed back against the dumpster. Julian reacted without thinking. He caught her shoulder, steadying her before she hit the ground fully. Easy, he said. Don't fight me on this. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Funny thing to say, she murmured. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. She closed her eyes again. Just, help costs something. I learned that. The words lingered between them. Julian straightened, exhaling slowly through his nose. He wasn't used to being resisted like this. People usually said yes quickly when he offered help. Too quickly. He had learned to read gratitude, embarrassment, even quiet resentment. But this was different. This was fear. Listen, he said, lowering his voice. I'm not here to make a scene. I just want to get you somewhere warm. We'll figure out the rest later. Renee opened her eyes again. You always say that, she replied softly. He blinked. I do. She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced past him down the alley as if checking for something, or someone. Julian followed her gaze instinctively. Nothing. Just trash bags and brick and shadows. But the way her shoulders tensed made his skin prickle. Are you hurt? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded slightly. My ankle. Twisted it last week. Slipped on ice. Did you see a doctor? A humorless smile flickered across her face. I can't even see a mirror. That settled it. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket. I'm calling a car. Renee's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers were cold, her nails cracked. No, she said quickly. No police. No ambulance. It's not the police, he said. Just a ride. She searched his face, suspicion etched deep into her expression. You promise? Yes, he said. I promise. The word promise seemed to drain what little strength she had left. Her grip loosened. She nodded once, exhausted. Getting her up took longer than he expected. Renee leaned heavily on him, her body light in a way that made his chest ache. Each step was careful, measured. She winced but didn't complain. When they reached the mouth of the alley, the sudden brightness of the street made her flinch. She pulled the coat tighter around herself. I look awful, she muttered. Julian almost said something reassuring. Almost told her she looked fine. He stopped himself. Lying wouldn't help either of them. You look cold, he said instead. That's fixable. The car arrived within minutes. The driver glanced at Renee, then at Julian, then wisely kept his mouth shut. As the car pulled away, Renee pressed her forehead against the window. The city lights streaked past, reflections blurring across the glass. For a while, neither of them spoke. Julian's mind raced. Questions piled up faster than he could sort them. How long had she been out here? Why hadn't she called him? Where had the apartment gone? And why did she look like she was bracing for something worse than homelessness? You don't have to do this, Renee said suddenly. He turned to her. Do what? This, she said, gesturing vaguely between them. Playing rescuer. I'm not playing anything, he replied. I found someone I know in trouble. She shook her head. You found someone you used to know. The distinction stung. They arrived at the hotel, a quiet place, discreet, the kind Julian used when he didn't want attention. The lobby was warm. Too warm. Renee swayed slightly as they stepped inside. Julian checked them in quickly, his tone clipped. The receptionist didn't ask questions. Up in the room, Renee stood awkwardly near the door, unsure where to put herself. She stared at the clean bed like it might disappear if she touched it. You can shower, Julian said. There are clean towels. I'll have food sent up. She nodded, still not moving. Renee, he said gently. You're safe. For tonight at least. She finally looked at him, really looked at him. That's what scares me, she said. Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Whatever had happened to her didn't end with losing an apartment. And he was beginning to realize that finding her in that alley was only the beginning. Renee didn't sleep. Julian noticed it the moment he returned to the room the next morning. He had left her alone after arranging food and fresh clothes, giving her space the way people with power rarely remembered to do. When he came back just after sunrise, carrying coffee he hadn't touched and a paper bag with breakfast, she was sitting on the edge of the bed exactly where he'd left her hours earlier. Same posture. Same tight grip on the coat he'd given her, now folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were open, red-rimmed, fixed on the window where pale winter light slipped through the curtains. You should have slept, Julian said quietly. She turned her head slowly as if it took effort. I tried. He set the coffee down. Did you eat? She nodded once. A little. It was the kind of answer people gave when they didn't want to be questioned further. Julian pulled a chair closer and sat, careful not to crowd her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier here than it had in the alley. Clean walls didn't soften discomfort. They amplified it. You didn't answer me last night, he said finally. About the apartment. Renee's jaw tightened. She looked down at her hands. I know, she said. I wasn't accusing you, he added quickly. I just don't understand. That's fair, she replied. Most people don't. Julian exhaled slowly. He had spent years in boardrooms negotiating hostile takeovers, reading body language, sensing when someone was hiding leverage. But this wasn't business. This was something more fragile. Start wherever you want, he said. Renee was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. Then she spoke. Do you remember the first day I worked for you? He nodded. You corrected the house manager about how you wanted the floors cleaned. A faint smile touched her lips. You noticed that? I did. I almost quit that day, she admitted. Your house was intimidating. Everything shiny. Everything expensive. I kept thinking I didn't belong there. Julian shifted uncomfortably. You were good at your job. I had to be, she said. There's no room for mistakes when people think they're doing you a favor by letting you in. The words weren't bitter, just factual. She took a breath. When you sold the house and you gave me that apartment, I thought maybe I had finally caught up. Like life had slowed down enough for me to breathe. Her fingers curled inward. I was wrong. Julian leaned forward slightly. What happened? Renee hesitated, then shook her head. Not yet. The refusal surprised him. Why not? Because if I say it out loud, she replied, it becomes real. And once it's real, I have to admit how stupid I was. That's not fair to yourself, Julian said. She laughed softly, humorless. Fairness hasn't been part of my life for a long time. She stood suddenly, pacing the small room. Every step was careful, guarded, as if she expected the floor to give way. You gave me that apartment, she continued. But it came at a time when I was already carrying too much. Grief, debt, worry. You didn't cause that. But you also didn't see it. Julian felt a flicker of defensiveness rise in his chest, then fade. She was right. He hadn't asked much. He had assumed money filled in the gaps. I thought I was helping, he said. You were, she replied quickly. Just not in the way that lasts. She stopped pacing and faced him. Tell me something, Julian. When things go wrong for you, how far do you fall? The question caught him off guard. I don't understand. When you mess up, she said, do you end up on a couch? Or in a car? Or in an alley? He didn't answer. She nodded. That's what I thought. The room felt smaller. Julian rubbed his hands together, grounding himself. I can call someone, he said. A lawyer. A housing advocate. We can sort this out. Renee's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to him. You can't sort this out yet. Why not? Because you still think this is about an apartment. Her voice lowered. It's not. Julian felt the unease deepen, a slow realization that whatever she was protecting herself from had nothing to do with paperwork or rent. Renee, he said carefully, what aren't you telling me? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room, opened her bag, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She didn't hand it to him yet. She just held it. There are reasons, she said. I didn't come back to you when things started going wrong. Julian's stomach tightened as he watched her fingers tremble around the paper. And once you hear them, she added, you might wish you'd never asked. Julian stared at the folded paper in Renee's hand like it might explode. She still hadn't given it to him. Just stood there, holding it between two fingers, as if weighing whether letting go would cost her more than keeping it. Then don't, he said quietly. Don't tell me if you don't want to. Renee let out a slow breath. That's the problem, she replied. I want to. I just don't know how. She walked back to the bed and sat down, smoothing the blanket with unnecessary care. The habit was automatic, something learned from years of cleaning other people's messes before tending to her own. You asked where the apartment went, she said. The truth is, it didn't disappear all at once. Julian sat back, listening. At first, everything was fine, she continued. Too fine. I had heat. A door that locked. I could buy groceries without counting every dollar twice. I started sleeping through the night. Her voice softened, almost wistful. That's how I knew something was wrong. Nothing stays calm that long. Julian frowned. What do you mean? I mean peace makes you careless, she said. It makes you think old problems won't find you again. She reached for the paper, unfolding it just enough to glance at it herself before refolding it quickly. Whatever was written there, she wasn't ready to share yet. Did someone take the apartment from you? Julian asked. A landlord? A bank? Renee shook her head. No. Someone took advantage of me. The words landed heavier than he expected. Who? He asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the door again. Julian followed her gaze, irritation flickering through him. You're safe here, he said. No one's listening. That's what my sister thought, Renee replied. Julian stiffened. Your sister? She nodded. You never met her. Her name was Cynthia. Something about the way she said it, past tense wrapped in caution, made his chest tighten. She worked in houses like yours, Renee went on. Different neighborhoods, different families, same rules. Be quiet. Be grateful. Don't make trouble. Julian shifted in his chair. Renee, if this is about something someone did to her, it's about what happened after, she interrupted gently. When she spoke up, Julian felt a familiar, unpleasant pressure build behind his eyes. Memories surfaced uninvited. A lawsuit. Years ago. Quiet. Settled quickly. Not his actions, but close enough to smell the smoke. Renee watched his face carefully, as if tracking every flicker of recognition. I watched my sister lose everything, she said. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Jobs dried up. References disappeared. Doors closed without explanation. She swallowed. All because she told the truth. Julian's voice came out hoarse. I didn't know. I know, she said again, the same words she'd used in the alley. But I knew what power does to people like us when it's uncomfortable. The room felt heavier, warmer, like the air had thickened. So when my own life started slipping, Renee continued, when the apartment became complicated, I told myself I'd handle it alone. I couldn't afford to owe anyone powerful another explanation. Julian leaned forward. What made it complicated? Renee hesitated. Then she sighed like someone surrendering. My son came back. Julian blinked. Devin? She nodded, eyes dropping to the floor. I hadn't heard from him in months. Then one night he was standing outside my door saying all the right things. Julian said nothing. He could already hear where this was going. He needed a place to stay, she said. Just for a little while. He promised he was trying to change. Her lips pressed together. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. She laughed softly. Funny thing about motherhood. You never stop thinking you can fix what you didn't break. Julian felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had access to my mail, Renee went on. My papers. I didn't think much of it at first. Then letters started coming. Bills I didn't recognize. Notices written in words meant to confuse people like me. She looked up at Julian, eyes sharp now. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already tangled. My name. My credit. The lease. Julian straightened. Why didn't you call me then? Renee's voice dropped to a whisper. Because I was afraid of what you'd see. And what's that? He asked. She met his gaze. That I failed with the help you gave me. The words hit harder than any accusation. Julian stood, pacing once, then stopping in front of her. Renee, this isn't failure. This is human, she finished for him. I know. But try telling that to yourself when you're sitting in a courtroom, watching a judge talk about numbers you don't have. Julian froze. Courtroom? Renee closed her eyes. I fought it, she said. Not well enough. She opened her eyes again and finally held the folded paper out toward him. This, she said, is where the apartment went. Julian took it, his pulse quickening as he unfolded the page. And as his eyes moved across the words, he realized with a sickening certainty that the alley had never been the worst part of her story. Julian read the paper twice before it made sense. Not because the words were complicated, but because they felt unreal. Eviction notice. Court date. Legal language wrapped around simple facts. The lease tangled in debt claims. Failure to appear. Judgment entered. He lowered the page slowly. You went to court alone? He asked. Renee nodded. I didn't have a lawyer. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out sharper than he meant it to. She flinched. Because you already did enough. Julian exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to slow down. Getting angry wouldn't change the past. And the anger, he realized, wasn't really at her. It was at himself. How long ago was this? He asked. Almost 2 years, she said. 2 years. The number hit him harder than anything else. Where did you go after? He asked quietly. Renee didn't answer right away. She took the paper back from him, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her bag like it was something fragile. At first I stayed with a friend, she said. Just a couch. Then another. People get tired. Even good people. Julian nodded. He understood that kind of fatigue. He'd felt it in relationships that looked solid until they weren't. I told myself it was temporary, she continued. That I just needed to get back on my feet. But every time I tried, something else fell through. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She pressed them together to stop the shaking. Shelters? Julian asked. She hesitated. A few nights. He waited. They're loud, she said. Crowded. You learn not to sleep too deeply. You keep your shoes on. Julian swallowed. And when that didn't work? He asked. Renee shrugged. You learn other ways. She didn't elaborate and he didn't push. Some things didn't need details to be understood. Julian stood and walked to the window. Outside the city moved on. Cars. Pedestrians. Someone laughing on a phone call. He wondered how many people passed Renee every day without really seeing her. How did you end up in that alley? He asked. Renee looked down. It was close. And quiet. That's not an answer. She gave him a small, tired smile. It's the only one I have. Silence stretched again, heavier now. Julian turned back to her. I can fix this, he said. I can get you a place today. A real one. No paperwork surprises. No waiting. Renee stiffened. No, she said immediately. Julian blinked. No. I don't want another apartment like that, she said. Not from you. Not yet. He felt irritation flare, then confusion. Renee, you were sleeping in trash. And now I'm not, she replied calmly. Because you found me. That doesn't mean I want to go back to the same imbalance. The word imbalance lingered between them. You think helping you puts me above you, Julian said slowly. I think it already does, she replied. Whether you mean it to or not. Julian opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She wasn't wrong. Money always came with weight, with expectation, even when wrapped in kindness. What do you want then? He asked. Renee leaned back against the bed, exhausted. Time, she said. And options. I can give you both. She shook her head. Not like before. Julian studied her, really studied her. The pride. The fear. The quiet strength that had kept her going far longer than anyone should have to. All right, he said finally. Then we do this differently. Renee looked at him, surprised. You mean that? Yes, he said. But I need you to meet me halfway. She hesitated. How? We start with help that doesn't come from me directly, Julian said. Programs. People who don't answer to my name. Renee considered this. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. There's one more thing, she said. Julian waited. My son, she said quietly. If he finds out where I am. She didn't finish the sentence. Julian felt a chill run through him. What about your son? He asked. Renee looked up at him, fear finally breaking through her careful composure. He doesn't stay gone forever, she said. And when he comes back, things get worse. The words settled heavily in the room. Julian realized then that helping Renee wasn't just about undoing a past mistake. It was about stepping into a future that might fight back. Renee had learned how to disappear long before she ever set foot in Julian Cross's house. She didn't tell him that outright. Instead, as the morning stretched on and the hotel room filled with the muted noise of traffic below, she began talking about the past the way people do when they aren't sure they'll be allowed to finish. My mother used to say there are two kinds of people, she said. The ones who take up space and the ones who survive by not needing any. Julian sat quietly listening. I learned early which one I was, she continued. You don't argue. You don't complain. You do what's asked and you do it well enough that people depend on you, but not so much that they feel threatened. She glanced at him. That's how I survived your house. Julian shifted, uncomfortable. I never meant for. I know, she said gently. That's the thing. Most harm isn't loud. Her words stayed with him as she talked. She described her mornings back then. Waking up before sunrise. Catching 2 buses across the city. Standing at the stop with other women like her, quiet, bundled up, eyes forward. None of them talked much. They all understood the rules. When she arrived at Julian's house, everything smelled clean. Lemon polish. Fresh laundry. Money. She worked methodically, room by room, learning the rhythms of the household without ever being taught. She learned when to make herself scarce. When to be present. When to pretend not to hear raised voices behind closed doors. You were polite, she told him. Always said hello. Always thanked me. But you were busy. Distracted. You lived in your head most of the time. Julian nodded slowly. He couldn't deny it. Your wife, Renee paused, choosing her words carefully. She didn't like reminders that other people existed in her space. Julian winced. I kept my head down, Renee said. Did my job. That's how you keep a job like that. You don't bring your problems into other people's homes. She smiled faintly. Even when your husband dies. Julian looked up sharply. Renee, I didn't know Calvin passed until months later. I didn't tell anyone, she said. Grief makes people uncomfortable. And uncomfortable people stop calling. She described coming back to work 3 days after the funeral because she couldn't afford not to. How she scrubbed floors while her chest felt hollow. How she cried quietly in the laundry room where no one would hear. And no one asked, she said. Which was a relief. Julian felt a heaviness settle over him. He'd thought of her as steady because she'd been forced to be. When things started falling apart between you and your wife, Renee continued, I saw it coming before either of you said it out loud. How? Julian asked. You stopped sleeping, she replied. You drank more. And you avoided the house. Julian let out a breath. I thought I hid it. You did, she said. From people who mattered to you. The divorce, when it came, was sudden to outsiders. To Renee it felt inevitable. Boxes packed. Rooms emptied. Voices tense, then cold. On her last day in that house, she stood in the kitchen after everything was gone. No furniture. No noise. Just echoes. That was the first time I thought about what would happen to me, she said. Not you. Not your wife. Me. Julian remembered that day now with uncomfortable clarity. How he'd handed her the envelope with the apartment information. How relieved he'd felt, as if tying off a loose end. I told myself I was doing the right thing, he said quietly. You were, Renee replied. But you were also moving on. The truth stung. She leaned back against the pillows, exhaustion finally catching up to her. I don't blame you, she added. I just need you to understand how easy it is to mistake distance for safety. Julian watched her, seeing her not as an employee, not even as someone he'd helped, but as a woman who had spent her entire life navigating other people's comfort. When Devon came back, she said softly, I was already tired. Too tired to question him the way I should have. Julian's jaw tightened. He knew how to sound convincing, she continued. He always has. She stopped there, her voice trailing off. Julian waited, but she didn't continue. What aren't you saying? He asked gently. Renee stared at the ceiling, eyes glassy. That the same instincts that kept me employed are the ones that almost destroyed me. Julian felt a familiar unease settle in his gut, because he was beginning to understand that Renee's downfall wasn't an accident, was a pattern. And patterns, once formed, rarely ended without a fight. The divorce unfolded the way disasters often do, quietly, then all at once. Renee remembered the exact week it shifted. Julian started coming home later. Sometimes he didn't come home at all. The house stayed spotless, untouched by real living, like a museum that had lost its curator. She learned to read the signs without trying. The extra bottle in the cabinet. The way Julian stood at the window longer than necessary, phone pressed to his ear, saying very little. It wasn't my business, she told him now in the hotel room. But it was my workplace. Those things are never separate. Julian nodded. He remembered those months as a blur of negotiations and resentment. He hadn't considered how visible it all was to someone who cleaned around the mess he left behind. Your wife stopped speaking to me first, Renee continued. Not directly. She just stopped acknowledging I was there. Julian closed his eyes briefly. That sounds like her. Renee didn't comment on that. She talked about the night the argument spilled into the open. Raised voices echoing through hallways too large to contain them. She'd been folding towels in the laundry room, the door half closed, pretending not to hear. I knew not to interfere, she said. But I also knew when to make myself scarce. The next morning the house felt hollow. Julian's wife was gone. So were half the closets. She didn't say goodbye, Renee said. She didn't say anything. Julian exhaled slowly. Neither did I. From that point on, everything moved quickly. Lawyers, appraisals, meetings held in rooms that still smelled like fresh paint and disappointment. You stopped noticing details, Renee said. Little things. Burned out lights. Leaks. You were already gone. She described how Julian wandered the house at night, restless, drinking alone. How he'd sit at the kitchen counter, staring at nothing, while she wiped the same surface over and over to give him space. I worried about you, she admitted. But that wasn't my role. Julian looked up. You could have said something. And risked my job? She asked gently. People don't like being seen when they're falling apart. The house went on the market within months. Open houses replaced dinner parties. Strangers commented on rooms Renee had kept immaculate for years. On her last official day, she cleaned a place that no longer felt like anyone's home. You gave me the envelope in the kitchen, she said. Right where I used to set your mail. Julian remembered the moment clearly now. The way he'd rehearsed what to say. the relief he'd felt once it was done. "I thought I was closing a chapter," he said. "You were?" Renee replied. "I was starting one." She smiled faintly at the memory. The apartment he'd arranged wasn't luxurious, but it was warm, quiet. Hers. "I cried that first night," she said. "Not because I was sad. Because no one else had keys." Julian swallowed. "For a while it was good," she continued. "I cooked. I slept. I didn't jump at every noise." Then her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "And then," she said, "the phone rang." Julian's spine stiffened. "Devon." "Yes." She described seeing his name on the screen and feeling that familiar mix of hope and dread. She hadn't heard from him in months. Maybe longer. "He said he was nearby," she said. "Said he just wanted to talk." Julian leaned forward slightly. "And you let him in?" Renee nodded. "Because I thought I was finally strong enough." She paused. "I wasn't." The room felt colder. Julian watched her carefully, sensing that this part of the story still held something sharp beneath the surface. "What happened after he showed up?" he asked. Renee didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the far wall, eyes unfocused, like she was back there again. "When someone knows all your weak spots," she said slowly, "they don't need to push very hard." She turned back to Julian. "And that's when things started to unravel in ways I didn't see until it was too late." Her voice was steady, but the look in her eyes told him the worst was still ahead. And whatever Devon had done, it wasn't just about money. At first, Devon was on his best behavior. Renee remembered noticing it immediately. The way he kept his shoes lined up neatly by the door. The way he washed his own dishes without being asked. The way he talked about plans, always plans, spoken with just enough confidence to sound real. "He knew exactly who to be," she said. "The version of himself I wanted to believe in." Julian listened, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Devon said he was between jobs. Said he was staying clean. Said he just needed a place to regroup. He talked about certifications, about starting over somewhere new. He laughed easily, hugged her longer than usual, told her she looked tired. "You never stop wanting to hear that your child is okay," Renee said. "Even when your instincts are screaming." For the first few weeks, things stayed calm. Devon left in the mornings. Came back in the evenings. He paid for groceries once, making a show of it. "That should have scared me," she admitted. "It didn't." Julian asked quietly, "When did you notice the shift?" Renee exhaled. "Little things. He stopped leaving early. Said the bus routes were unreliable. He started getting mail." Julian frowned. "Mail?" She nodded. "At first just one envelope. Then more. He said it was temporary. Job applications. Insurance." She paused. "I wanted to believe that too." Devon spent more time on his phone. He paced when he talked. Sometimes he whispered, sometimes he snapped at people Renee couldn't hear. At night, Renee lay awake listening to his footsteps, counting them without realizing she was doing it. "You start to feel like a guest in your own home," she said. "Like you have to earn the right to relax." Julian felt his stomach knot. Then came the first letter with her name on it. She opened it standing at the kitchen counter. "Past due notice. Amount owed." Words written in a tone that assumed she already understood things she didn't. "I thought it was a mistake," she said. "I thought maybe someone had mixed up accounts." She showed it to Devon. He barely glanced at it. "Probably nothing," he said. "I'll look into it." And she let him. More letters came. Different envelopes. Different logos. All with her name. All demanding things she didn't recognize. Renee's voice dropped. "That's when I realized I didn't know how many things were in my name." Julian leaned back, anger flickering across his face. "Did he take out loans?" "I don't know what he took out," she said. "I only know what came due." She described sitting at the small kitchen table late at night, papers spread out in front of her, trying to piece together a puzzle designed to confuse her. "I didn't grow up learning this language," she said. "Credit, interest, claims, liens. It's all written to make you feel stupid for not knowing." Julian clenched his jaw. Devon stopped coming home some nights. When he did, he was defensive, irritated. "You don't trust me?" he'd snapped once when she questioned him. Renee had apologized. That memory made her shake her head now, disgusted with herself. "I apologized for asking my own son why my life was falling apart." Julian stood and paced the room once. "You were being manipulated." "Yes," she said. "But manipulation only works when there's love to twist." The first official notice about the lease came weeks later. A legal-looking envelope. Warnings about disputes tied to her name. "I went to the leasing office," Renee said. "They told me it wasn't about rent. That the unit was tied up in a claim." Julian stopped pacing. "A claim from who?" Renee's lips pressed together. "From a lender. One I had never heard of." The apartment, safe, quiet, hers, suddenly felt temporary. "And Devon?" Julian asked. She looked down. "Gone. Vanished. Phone disconnected." Julian exhaled sharply. "I kept thinking he'd come back," Renee said. "That he'd explain. Fix it." She laughed softly. "That's the lie you tell yourself when you're not ready to face the truth." Julian met her gaze. "And the truth was?" Renee's eyes glistened. "That love doesn't protect you from being used." The room was silent. Julian realized then that the apartment he'd given her hadn't been taken by chance. It had been dismantled from the inside. And Renee had watched it happen, hoping it would stop on its own. It didn't. By the time Renee realized she was in real trouble, the language stopped being polite. The letters changed tone. What had started as notice became demand. What had sounded like a misunderstanding hardened into threats dressed up as procedure. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, as if the paper itself carried judgment. "I stopped opening them right away," she admitted. "I'd set them on the counter and tell myself I'd deal with them after work." Julian didn't interrupt. He could hear the pattern forming. Delay. Denial. Fear. She described how she started avoiding phone calls from unknown numbers. How she let voicemail pile up, each message tighter than the last. She didn't want to hear another voice telling her she owed something she didn't understand. "You think if you don't look at it, it won't grow," she said. "But it does." One afternoon she came home to a notice taped to the door. Formal. Unforgiving. "I remember standing there longer than I should have," she said. "People passed me in the hallway. Nobody asked if I was okay." She went to the leasing office the next day, carrying every piece of paper she had. The woman behind the desk was polite, professional, distant. "She kept saying the same thing," Renee said. "That it wasn't personal. That my unit was attached to a financial dispute." Julian shook his head slowly. "But the rent was paid." "Yes," Renee replied. That didn't matter. The claim, she was told, gave a lender leverage. The apartment was collateral in a mess that wasn't hers, but was tied to her name. Until it was resolved, her lease meant very little. "They suggested I talk to a lawyer," she said. "I asked how much that would cost." Julian didn't need her to answer. He could see it in her face. "I tried to fight it myself," she continued. "I filled out forms I barely understood. I stood in lines. I asked questions that made people sigh." She laughed quietly. "Nothing makes you feel smaller than realizing the system doesn't have a place for your confusion." Devon stayed gone. No explanations. No apologies. Renee still set aside his mail when it arrived, stacking it neatly by the door like he might walk in any minute. Julian's voice tightened. "You were protecting him." "I know," she said. "I was also protecting myself from the truth." The court date came faster than she expected. A single line on a letter, easy to miss if you didn't know what it meant. "I took the day off work," she said. "Wore my best coat. I thought that might help." The courtroom was cold and crowded. Renee sat alone, surrounded by people who spoke fluently in legal language. When her case was called, she stood on shaky legs. "I tried to explain," she said. "I told them I didn't understand how my apartment could be taken when I hadn't missed rent." She swallowed. The judge was patient. But patience doesn't change rules. Without representation, without proof she didn't have, the outcome was brief and final. Judgment entered. Eviction scheduled. "I walked out holding that paper," Renee said. and it felt like my life had been decided in a hallway. Julian's hands clenched into fists. You shouldn't have gone through that alone. She met his gaze. I wasn't alone, she said. I just didn't have help that counted. After the eviction date, everything moved quickly. Notices. Deadlines. No room to catch her breath. The apartment emptied out faster than she could process. Boxes stacked by the door. Silence where safety used to live. The night before I had to leave, Renee said, her voice barely steady, I slept on the floor. Julian frowned. Why? She gave a small, broken smile. Because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be close to the ground. She looked at him then, eyes dark with something unresolved. And that was still the easiest night that came after. The implication hung in the air. Julian understood now that losing the apartment wasn't the end of her fall. It was the moment the ground gave way entirely. And he hadn't yet heard how far she'd gone after that. After the apartment, Renee learned how quickly space runs out. The first night, she stayed with a woman from church. A spare couch. A blanket that smelled like fabric softener in someone else's life. Renee was careful. She folded the blanket in the morning, washed her mug, stayed quiet. You don't want to feel temporary, she said. So you try not to leave traces. Julian listened, his expression unreadable. The second place lasted a week. The third, 3 nights. Each time the unspoken rules were the same. Don't ask for much. Don't take up room. Don't stay too long. I told everyone the same thing, Renee said. I'll be out of your way soon. Soon never came. She kept working as long as she could, catching buses earlier, staying later. She told herself that as long as she was earning something, this wasn't real yet. This was just a rough patch. Then her ankle gave out. It happened on a slick sidewalk outside a grocery store. One wrong step. A sharp pain that made her cry out before she could stop herself. I sat there until the cold went numb, she said. I didn't want anyone to see me. The injury made everything harder. Walking hurt. Standing too long hurt. Some shifts disappeared quietly after that. You don't get fired, she said. You just stop getting calls. With fewer hours came fewer options. People started noticing how long she'd been around. The couch invitations dried up without explanation. I don't blame them, she added quickly. Everyone has their limits. She tried shelters again. This time longer. She learned which ones filled up fastest. Which ones felt safest. Which ones you avoided if you had any choice. You sleep light, she said. You learn what noises mean trouble. Julian felt something twist in his chest. She described waiting in lines that wrapped around buildings. Intake forms. Curfews. Rules that treated everyone the same regardless of how they got there. You give up control, she said. Not all at once. Piece by piece. When winter came, things grew desperate. Renee slept on buses when she could, riding until the route ended and back again. She found quiet corners in public places where no one looked too closely. And sometimes, she said softly, you find an alley. Julian looked down, remembering the night he'd found her. That alley wasn't the first, she admitted. Just the last one that mattered. Silence settled over the room. Julian cleared his throat. How long were you out there? Renee shrugged. Long enough to stop being surprised. She stood and walked slowly to the window, favoring her ankle. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. I thought about calling you, she said without turning around. A lot. Julian's chest tightened. Why didn't you? She faced him then, eyes tired but honest. Because I needed to know how far I could fall without help. The words stunned him. I needed to know who I was without anyone catching me, she continued. And now I know. Julian struggled to respond. And who are you? Renee considered the question. Someone who survived, she said. But not someone who wants to live like that again. She turned back to the bed, sat slowly and met his gaze. There's still something you don't know, she added. Julian felt his pulse quicken. What is it? Renee inhaled deeply. The reason I didn't come back to you, she said, isn't just pride. The room felt suddenly too quiet. Julian realized then that the story still had a door he hadn't opened. And whatever was behind it was heavier than everything she'd told him so far. Renee didn't explain right away. She sat there, hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the carpet like it might give her permission to continue. Julian had learned that silence from her meant something dangerous was coming. Not dramatic, just heavy. When I left your house that last time, she said slowly, I wasn't just leaving the job. Julian's jaw tightened. He remembered that day clearly. Her small suitcase, the careful way she'd thanked him, the look in her eyes that had unsettled him even then. I thought you were angry with me, he said. I was, she replied. But not for the reason you think. She took a breath, then another, like she was bracing herself against cold water. Do you remember the guest room renovation? She asked. Julian nodded. Of course. You helped pick the paint. And the contractor, she continued. The one who came by when you were traveling. Julian's brow furrowed. What about him? Renee's fingers tightened together. He came back one afternoon. Said there was an issue with the wiring. Julian felt a faint chill crawl up his spine. I told him you weren't home, she said. He said you knew he was coming. She paused, eyes flicking up to Julian's face, then back down. I believed him. The room seemed to shrink. He asked me to show him the basement, she continued, her voice steady but thin. I didn't think anything of it. I'd been down there dozens of times. Julian leaned forward slightly. Renee. He locked the door behind us, she said. The words landed with a dull thud, like something dropped too close to glass. I don't want to go into every detail, she added quickly. But he knew exactly how to make it seem small. Accidental. Like something I could talk myself out of. Julian's hands trembled. He pressed them against his knees. I told myself it was my fault, Renee said. That I'd misunderstood. That I shouldn't ruin anyone's life over confusion. Her mouth twisted into a humorless smile. Funny how the mind protects everyone except you. Julian stood abruptly, pacing once before stopping himself. Why didn't you tell me? She looked up then, eyes sharp. And say what? That the man you hired crossed a line? That your house wasn't as safe as you thought? That doesn't matter, Julian snapped, then softened. You mattered. I know that now, she said. I didn't then. She explained how she'd quit shortly after. How she told herself distance would fix the unease crawling under her skin. How she'd thrown herself into building a life with Devon because it felt easier to be needed than protected. And then, she said quietly, I found out I was pregnant. Julian froze. For a moment, she continued, I convinced myself it had to be Devon's. Timing is a strange liar. Her voice cracked just slightly. Then the doctor gave me dates. The room went silent again. I didn't tell Devon, she said. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself I could handle it. Julian swallowed hard. What happened? Renee looked away. I lost the pregnancy. Early. Before there was anything to explain. Julian felt like the air had been knocked out of him. I grieved alone, she said. And then I buried it. Or thought I did. Her gaze returned to him, steady now. That's why I couldn't come back to you. Every time I thought about asking for help, I pictured your house. That basement. And I couldn't separate you from it. Julian sank back into the chair, stunned. I never reported him, Renee added. By the time I realized I should have, he was gone. Company dissolved. No forwarding address. Julian's voice was hoarse. I should have known. You couldn't have, she said gently. But I needed you to understand why I disappeared. Why I didn't reach out when I was sleeping in places no one should. She stood, moving slowly as if her body remembered things her mind wanted to forget. I wasn't just running from pride, she said. I was running from a version of myself that still felt unsafe around kindness. Julian stood as well, his expression a mixture of anger, guilt, and something close to grief. I hired him, he said. I brought him into that house. Renee shook her head. What he did was his choice. They stood there, facing each other, the past stretched between them like a fault line. Julian opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. There's something else, Renee said before he could. Her voice was quiet but firm. The reason that man was never found, she said, is because someone else was looking for him first. Julian's eyes narrowed. Who? He asked. Renee hesitated. The same person, she said slowly, who knew exactly where to find me after everything fell apart. The implication sent a chill through Julian. He realized then that Renee's story wasn't just about what she'd survived. It was also about someone who had been watching all along. Julian didn't sit back down. He stayed where he was, standing too still as if any movement might tip something over. Someone was watching you, he said carefully. From when? Renee walked back to the bed and lowered herself onto the edge. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. The kind of control people learn after chaos. From before I ever left your house, she said. I just didn't know it yet. She told him about the first sign she'd ignored. A car that seemed to idle too long across the street from her apartment. A man she noticed twice at the same bus stop, days apart, wearing different jackets but the same expressionless stare. I told myself I was being dramatic, she said. You don't want to believe your life is interesting enough for anyone to track. Julian felt a knot forming in his stomach. And Devin? He noticed things too, she admitted. That's the part one didn't tell you earlier. She explained how Devin had grown tense in the months before he vanished. How he'd started checking locks twice. How he'd once asked her, out of nowhere, whether anyone from her past might still be angry with her. I laughed, Renee said quietly. I told him I cleaned houses. Who would care that much? Julian exhaled slowly. What changed? One night, she said, someone left a note on our windshield. Her fingers traced an invisible rectangle on her knee. It wasn't threatening, she said. That was the worst part. It just said, you should be more careful who you trust. Julian's jaw clenched. Did you call the police? Renee shook her head. Devin didn't want to. He said without proof, it would just make things worse. She paused. That was the last fight we had. The day Devin disappeared, he told her he was meeting someone about a job lead. He'd kissed her forehead, promised dinner. He never came back, she said. And his phone went dead that same night. Julian rubbed his temples. You think the same person is responsible? I don't think, Renee said. I know. She described a man she'd first noticed at a shelter weeks after Devin vanished. Clean clothes. No bag. Watching the room like he wasn't there to sleep. He knew my name, she said. He said it like we'd met before. Julian felt cold spread through him. What did he want? To make sure I stayed quiet, Renee replied. The man hadn't threatened her. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply listed details about her life. Where she'd worked. Who she'd lived with. Even the hospital she'd gone to after losing the pregnancy. He told me some people don't like unresolved problems, she said. And that disappearing is easier when you're already invisible. Julian's voice dropped. Who was he? Renee hesitated. I don't know his name. But I know who he worked for. She told him about the contractor again. How months after everything she'd finally searched deeper. Different company names. Shell businesses. A pattern of complaints that never stuck. He wasn't just a contractor, she said. He was a fixer. Someone hired to make problems go away quietly. Julian felt a flash of anger. And you were a problem. Yes, she said. And so was Devin once he started asking questions. The weight of it settled over them, thick and suffocating. So why are you safe now? Julian asked. Why hasn't this person come back? Renee met his eyes. Because someone else intervened. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges. She handed it to Julian. It was a card. Plain. No logo. Just a name and a phone number. An investigator, she said. Private. Expensive. He found me after I started sleeping on buses. Julian looked up sharply. Who hired him? Renee's lips pressed together. That's what I don't know. The investigator had helped her quietly. Gotten her a temporary ID after hers was stolen. Warned her which shelters to avoid. Told her when to move. He said someone wanted me alive, she said. Not comfortable. Just alive. Julian's voice was tight. And Devon? The silence answered before she did. He couldn't find him, Renee said. But he told me something else. She swallowed. He said the contractor was dead. Julian's breath caught. Dead? Car accident, Renee said. Single vehicle. No witnesses. Julian stared at the card in his hand. Someone cleaned up the mess, Renee continued. But not for justice. For containment. Julian finally sat down, the implication spiraling. So you've been living under someone else's protection, he said. More like permission, she replied. As long as I didn't make noise. Julian looked at her, really looked at her, and understood something he'd missed before. Renee hadn't just been homeless. She'd been hiding. And now? Julian asked. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low. Now someone found me anyway, she said. Julian felt his phone vibrate in his pocket at that exact moment. He pulled it out, heart pounding. Unknown number. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Renee watched his face carefully. Answer it, she said. Julian hesitated, then swiped the screen. Hello. There was a pause on the other end. Then a calm, unfamiliar voice. Mr. Caldwell, the voice said. We need to talk about Renee. The line stayed open. Waiting. Julian didn't put the phone on speaker. He didn't need to. Renee could read his face as clearly as if the voice were echoing through the room. Who is this? Julian asked. The voice on the other end was calm. Not rushed. Not aggressive. The kind of calm that suggested control. Someone who has been aware of Miss Turner's situation for a long time, the man replied. And someone who would prefer this conversation remain private. Julian glanced at Renee. She gave a small nod. You already said her name, Julian said. So let's skip pretending this is casual. A brief pause. Then a soft exhale. Fair enough, the man said. I represent interests that were inconvenienced several years ago. Renee's shoulders stiffened. You mean the contractor, Julian said. Yes. The word landed cleanly without hesitation. Julian felt his pulse spike. He's dead. So I've heard, the man replied. That was unfortunate. Messy. Renee stood, pacing slowly despite her ankle. If he's dead, why are you calling? She asked, close enough now that Julian could feel the tension radiating from her. Because loose ends don't disappear just because one person does, the man said. They fray. They tangle. And sometimes they resurface in inconvenient ways. Julian's jaw tightened. Say what you want. The man didn't rise to the challenge. You've recently brought Miss Turner into your home, he said. That changes the equation. Julian's stomach dropped. You've been watching me. We watch patterns, the man corrected. Your routines. Your security upgrades. Your charitable donations. All public-facing, I assure you. Renee stopped pacing. Why now? Because visibility creates risk, the man said. And because your circumstances have shifted. Julian felt a surge of anger. If this is a threat. It's not, the man interrupted gently. It's a clarification. Silence stretched. We intervened once to ensure Miss Turner's safety, the man continued. Quietly. Discreetly. We ensured certain individuals lost interest. Renee's voice was tight. By making my life smaller. Yes, the man said without apology. That was the trade-off. Julian clenched his free hand. And what do you want now? Another pause. Longer this time. We want to be certain Miss Turner remains exactly where she is, the man said. Alive. Quiet. Unremarkable. Renee let out a short, humorless laugh. That's your idea of protection? It's the kind that works, he replied. Julian shook his head. You don't get to dictate her life. I'm not dictating, the man said. I'm advising. There's a difference. Renee stepped closer to Julian. What happens if we don't listen? The man didn't answer immediately. When people start asking questions, he said eventually, attention spreads. Media gets curious. Timelines resurface. Julian felt cold. You're saying you'll ruin her? No, the man said calmly. I'm saying the world will. Renee closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something harder there. You didn't protect Devon, she said. Another silence. He was not part of the original assessment, the man replied. He became a variable. Julian's voice sharpened. You're saying he didn't matter. I'm saying he complicated things, the man said. And complications carry consequences. Renee's hands curled into fists. You don't know what you took, she said. I know exactly what was taken, the man replied. And I know what remains. Julian felt something snap inside him. This conversation is over. Think carefully, the man said. Ending a call doesn't end a situation. Julian ended it anyway. The room fell into a heavy, ringing silence. Renee stood still, staring at the dark screen of the phone. He knows too much, Julian said. About me. About you. Yes, Renee replied. That's why he called you instead of me. Julian turned to her. We're not doing what he wants. Renee searched his face. You don't understand the scale of this. I understand control, Julian said. And I understand intimidation dressed up as concern. She hesitated. Julian, I won't hide you, he continued. And I won't shrink your life to make someone else comfortable. Renee's voice softened. That might put you in danger. He met her gaze. I've lived behind walls long enough to know when they're being used as cages. She studied him for a long moment. There's something you should know, she said. Julian waited. The investigator, she continued. The one who helped me. He didn't just disappear. Julian frowned. What do you mean? He warned me, she said quietly, that if I ever resurfaced in a way that mattered, someone would try to decide for me again. Julian's phone buzzed once more. A text this time. No name. Just coordinates. And a message beneath them. We need to meet. Tonight. Come alone. Renee read it over his shoulder. Her voice was barely a whisper. That's him, she said. Julian didn't respond to the message. He locked the phone and set it face down on the table like turning it over could dull its power. We're not meeting him, he said. Renee didn't argue right away. She walked to the window again, scanning the street below. Cars passed. A couple walked a dog. Normal life, uninterrupted. That's how he wins, she said finally. By forcing a choice where neither option feels safe. Julian joined her. You've spent years letting people decide things for you. That stops now. She looked at him, conflicted. You think refusing makes us strong. I think it makes us visible. Julian exhaled. We're already visible. Renee didn't answer. She reached into her bag again, slower this time, and pulled out something Julian hadn't seen before. A small flash drive. The investigator gave me this, she said. He told me never to open it unless I was prepared for everything to change. Julian's eyes narrowed. What's on it? I don't know exactly, she replied. But I know what it represents. She explained that during their last meeting, the investigator had hinted he was no longer working alone. That he'd found discrepancies too large to ignore. Money trails that led through shell companies, private security firms, even political donors. He said some people don't clean up messes, Renee said. They bury them under layers of legitimacy. Julian felt a chill. And this drive? He said it was leverage, she replied. Insurance. Julian turned to her. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? Because once you know, she said, you're part of it. The phone buzzed again. Same number. This is not optional. Julian's jaw tightened. That sounds like a threat. Renee nodded. It always does, eventually. They stood there, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Julian thought of the life he'd built, carefully controlled, meticulously protected. He'd spent years believing money could buy safety. Now he wasn't so sure. We don't go alone, he said. Renee shook her head. That's not what he asked. Julian looked at her sharply. And that matters to you? It matters to him, she replied. And that's the point. She turned, meeting Julian's eyes fully. If he wants control, denying him the meeting escalates things. If I go alone, at least I know the rules. Julian's voice dropped. You don't know his rules. I know his type, she said. Men who believe order justifies harm. Julian paced once, then stopped. Then we changed the terms. Renee frowned. How? He gestured toward the flash drive. We stopped treating that like a last resort. Her eyes widened slightly. You want to use it? I want to know what we're dealing with, Julian said. Before he decides how small your life should be again. Renee hesitated, then slowly handed him the drive. They connected it to a laptop. The screen flickered, then filled with folders. Dates, names, financial records, photos taken from a distance. Julian's breath caught. This is extensive. There's more, Renee said quietly. Emails appeared. Internal memos. Conversations that spoke in euphemisms instead of crimes. Resolve the issue. Neutralize exposure. Maintain discretion. Julian felt his stomach turn. These aren't freelancers. No, Renee said. They're infrastructure. One folder caught Julian's attention. A familiar name. Caldwell Holdings. His blood ran cold. That's impossible, he said. Renee leaned closer. What is it? He swallowed. My company's listed as a minor investor. Years ago. Passive. Automatic. Renee stared at him. You're connected. Julian shook his head. Not knowingly. These were bundled funds. I didn't authorize any of this. But your name is there, she said softly. Julian slammed the laptop shut, heart pounding. That's why he called me. Renee's voice trembled. Julian, this isn't just about me anymore. He met her gaze, guilt flooding his chest. It never should have touched you. Any of it. The phone buzzed again. 30 minutes. Last chance. Renee took a step back. If you're tied to them, even indirectly, meeting him puts you in the center. Julian straightened. Then that's exactly where I need to be. She searched his face. You could lose everything. He nodded. I already did, the moment I found you in that alley. They stood there, the choice no longer theoretical. Renee picked up the phone. I'll go, she said quietly. Julian grabbed her wrist. Not without me. She hesitated. Outside, a car idled at the curb longer than it needed to. Renee looked at it, then back at Julian. He's already here, she whispered. And for the first time since the call, fear gave way to something sharper. Resolve. The car didn't honk. It didn't flash its lights. Just waited. Julian watched it from behind the curtain, every instinct telling him this was intentional. Pressure without movement. A reminder that time was no longer theirs. Renee slipped on her coat, movement steady in a way that worried him more than panic would have. You don't have to come out, she said. If this goes wrong. I'm already in it, Julian replied. They made sure of that. She didn't argue again. That too unsettled him. They walked out together. Cold air hit Julian's face, sharp and grounding. The street looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Neighbors' windows glowed softly. Somewhere someone laughed. The car door opened before they reached it. The man inside looked unremarkable. Mid-40s, neat haircut, no visible tension. He smiled politely like someone greeting a colleague. Mr. Caldwell. Miss Turner, he said. Thank you for coming. Julian didn't return the smile. You said come alone. The man glanced between them. I assumed you'd test that boundary. Renee stopped a few feet from the car. You wanted to talk. Talk. The man gestured to the back seat. Somewhere warmer. Julian shook his head. Here is fine. For a moment, Julian thought the man might insist. Instead, he nodded as if this outcome had already been factored in. As you prefer, the man said. Time is limited anyway. He introduced himself only as Daniel. No last name? Julian asked. Daniel smiled faintly. Names are for people who expect to be remembered. Renee crossed her arms. Why now? Daniel studied her for a moment. Because you re-entered a life with weight, influence, resources. He looked at Julian. And because you made a mistake most people don't. Julian didn't flinch. Which was? You cared, Daniel said simply. The word landed heavier than any threat. You were meant to fade, Daniel continued, addressing Renee. Quietly, safely. We ensured that. You destroyed my life, Renee said. Daniel's expression didn't change. We preserved it. Julian felt anger surge. By stripping her choices. Choices are a luxury, Daniel replied. They belong to people without liabilities. Julian stepped closer. You don't get to define her as one. Daniel met his gaze. Your company already did. Julian's stomach tightened. You used my name. No, Daniel said. We used a system you benefited from. He spoke calmly, like this was an accounting discussion. Caldwell Holdings was part of a diversified portfolio, Daniel continued. You never asked where returns came from. Most people don't. Julian felt the truth of it land painfully. So you hide behind legitimate money? Daniel nodded. Legitimacy is the strongest armor there is. Renee's voice cut in. What do you want? Daniel looked at her again, more carefully this time. What we've always wanted. Stability. He gestured between them. Your reunion introduces volatility. Media interest is a possibility. Curiosity spreads. And Devon? Renee asked quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened just a fraction. He interfered. Julian caught it. The first crack. What did you do to him? Renee pressed. Daniel exhaled. He asked questions he couldn't answer safely. That's not an answer, Julian snapped. Daniel's gaze hardened. He's gone. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. Renee's breath caught. She turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Julian reached for her but stopped, unsure. Daniel watched them, assessing. You see, he said, this is why containment matters. Grief creates unpredictability. Julian's voice shook with controlled fury. You're not untouchable. Daniel smiled again, smaller this time. Everyone thinks that until they test it. Renee turned back, eyes wet but sharp. If we disappear again, this stops? Daniel nodded. Quiet lives. No inquiries. No exposure. And if we don't? Julian asked. Daniel's gaze flicked briefly to the building across the street. Then people start connecting dots they don't understand. And history doesn't treat that kindly. Julian understood the message. Pressure would come from everywhere. Financial audits. Public scrutiny. Character assassination. Daniel stepped back toward the car. You have 48 hours to decide. He paused. Miss Turner, you've survived worse. You know which choice hurts less. The car door closed softly. The engine started. Then it pulled away, unhurried. Renee stood frozen, staring at the empty space it left behind. They'll never stop, she said. Julian's voice was low. They will if they're exposed. She turned to him. You saw what's on that drive. This isn't one man. I know, Julian said. That's why we don't fight them quietly. Renee shook her head. People like him don't lose. They just shift. Julian met her eyes. Then we force them into the light. She searched his face, seeing not bravado but resolve grounded in consequence. And if it cost you everything? She asked. He didn't hesitate. Some things were never worth keeping. Renee looked down at her hands. They were shaking. There's something else, she said. Julian stiffened. What? When the investigator gave me the drive, she said, he told me one folder was a failsafe. Julian waited. If anything happened to me, she continued, it was meant to be released automatically. Julian's breath caught. Released to who? Renee swallowed. Journalists. Federal agencies. People who don't make problems disappear. Julian stared at her. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Because once it's triggered, she said, there's no going back. They stood in silence, the street suddenly feeling too open, too exposed. Julian understood now. This wasn't just a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between silence and war. And somewhere in the dark, forces far larger than either of them were already preparing for both outcomes. Sleep didn't come that night. Julian lay on top of the sheets, fully dressed, listening to the house breathe. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of the refrigerator. pipes ticking behind the walls. A distant siren that rose and fell like something searching. Renee sat at the small desk near the window, the laptop open but untouched. She hadn't turned it on again since Daniel left. The glow of the street light caught the edge of her face, sharp and tired. "They gave us 48 hours, she said quietly. "Which means they'll move sooner." Julian turned his head. "You think the deadline is fake?" "I think it's leverage," she replied. "Pressure makes people sloppy." Julian sat up. "Then we don't wait." Renee finally looked at him. "You're talking about triggering it?" "Yes," he said. "Or at least preparing to." She shook her head slowly. "Once that failsafe activates, there's no quiet ending. No stepping back into a smaller life." Julian stood and crossed the room. "You don't want a smaller life." Renee's jaw tightened. "I want a life where people don't get erased for asking questions." Julian nodded. "Then this is the cost." She looked down at her hands. "You don't understand what exposure does. It doesn't just punish the guilty. It burns everything nearby." Julian thought of his board, his investors, his carefully constructed reputation. He thought of the alley where he'd found her, curled in on herself like the world had taught her to disappear. "I know," he said, "but I also know what silence costs." They worked quietly after that. Julian made calls from a secure line, using favors he'd never wanted to cash in. A former federal prosecutor who now taught ethics. A journalist known for refusing anonymous tips unless they came with documentation thick enough to choke a desk. He didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. He asked one question. If something crossed your desk that tied legitimate corporations to systematic intimidation, how fast would it move? The answers were cautious, interested, not dismissive. Renee watched him, something conflicted in her eyes. "You're not built for this kind of mess," she said. Julian gave a humorless smile. "Neither were you." They paused when the lights flickered once, then steadied. Renee froze. "That happens." Julian frowned. "No." He walked to the breaker panel. Everything looked normal. Too normal. They didn't speak about it, but both of them felt the shift. The sense that the house was no longer just a refuge. Was a location. Later, as dawn edged pale along the windows, Renee finally spoke again. "The investigator warned me," she said. "He said they don't start with violence. They start with inconvenience." Julian turned. "What kind?" She listed them calmly. Frozen accounts. Sudden audits. Friends receiving quiet warnings. Safety framed as concern. Julian nodded. "Then we get ahead of it." He pulled up his laptop again, this time opening the flash drive. Renee tensed. "You said we'd wait." "I said we'd decide together," he replied. "I'm deciding we need more leverage." He navigated to the folder she'd mentioned. The failsafe. Inside were timestamps. Automated release schedules. Distribution lists. Julian's throat tightened. "This is thorough." "It had to be," Renee said. He didn't trust hope. He trusted systems. Julian scrolled. Names jumped out at him. Senators. Corporate officers. Foundations he recognized from charity galas. "This is bigger than I thought," he said. Renee's voice was flat. "It always is." Julian stopped scrolling. "There's a delay." "Yes," she said. 12 hours between activation and release. Enough time for one last warning. Julian looked up sharply. "To them?" "To us," Renee replied. "He said if it ever triggered, we'd know we'd crossed the point of no return." Julian leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then they're counting on us being afraid of that moment." Renee met his gaze. "I am afraid." "So am I," Julian said. "But I'm more afraid of letting them decide who gets to exist quietly." The doorbell rang. Both of them froze. It rang again. Slow. Patient. Julian held up a hand, signaling silence. He moved toward the door, every step measured. He checked the camera feed. A woman stood on the porch. Early 30s. Professional coat. Clipboard tucked under her arm. "Who is it?" Renee whispered. Julian's stomach dropped. "She's with the city." Renee's eyes widened. "Already?" The doorbell rang a third time. Julian didn't open it. A voice came through the door, calm and practiced. City Utilities. We need to verify some information regarding this property. Julian looked back at Renee. The inconvenience had begun, and it was arriving faster than either of them had planned. Julian didn't answer the door. He stood just out of view, watching the woman on the porch through the security feed. She shifted her weight, checked her clipboard, then glanced briefly down the street. Not impatient. Expectant. She's not Utilities, Renee whispered. Julian nodded. Utilities don't come unannounced at 6 in the morning. The woman pressed the doorbell again, then knocked. Polite. Mr. Caldwell, she called through the door. We just need a few minutes of your time. Julian's jaw tightened. She knew his name. Renee's pulse hammered in her ears. If you ignore her, what happens? She escalates, Julian said. They always do. He opened the door partway, leaving the chain latched. Yes. His voice was calm, measured. The woman smiled, professional warmth practiced to perfection. I'm with the city compliance office. There's been a report regarding recent changes to occupancy. Julian raised an eyebrow. Occupancy? Yes, she said smoothly. We just need to verify who's currently residing here. Renee felt her stomach drop. Julian didn't miss a beat. My household hasn't changed. The woman glanced at her clipboard. According to our information, a Miss Turner may be staying on the premises. Renee inhaled sharply despite herself. Julian's expression cooled. And who provided that information? I'm not authorized to disclose sources, the woman replied. But failure to cooperate could result in fines or further review. Julian leaned slightly closer to the door. This property is privately owned. Any inspection requires written notice. The woman's smile tightened. This isn't an inspection. It's a verification. Julian shook his head. Then we're done. He closed the door gently, locking it. Renee stared at him. They're trying to force me out. They're trying to make you feel unwelcome, Julian said. There's a difference. Almost immediately his phone buzzed. An email notification. Subject line. Notice of preliminary review, Caldwell Holdings. Julian exhaled slowly. That didn't take long. Renee crossed the room, reading over his shoulder. Her face drained of color. They're auditing you, she said. They're signaling, Julian replied. Audits take months. Fear works faster. Another notification followed. Then another. Bank alert. Meeting rescheduled. A board member requesting an urgent call. Renee backed away, shaking her head. This is what I meant. Everyone around you gets pulled in. Julian turned to her. This isn't your fault. That's easy for you to say, she replied sharply. You have something to lose. Julian held her gaze. So do you. She looked away. The rest of the morning unfolded like a controlled collapse. Calls came in waves. Julian answered some, ignored others. Each conversation carried the same undertone, concern framed as procedure, curiosity framed as compliance. By noon, a black sedan idled across the street. Not hiding. Not rushing. Watching. They want you gone before nightfall, Julian said quietly. Renee sank onto the edge of the couch. Then maybe I should go. Julian turned sharply. No. If I leave, she continued, this stops. Julian shook his head. It doesn't. It just resets. She looked up at him, eyes tired. I don't want to be the reason your life burns down. Julian sat across from her. You're the reason I'm finally paying attention to it. Silence settled between them, heavy but not empty. Renee broke it first. The failsafe. It hasn't been activated yet. Julian nodded. 12-hour delay. If we trigger it, she said, they'll know immediately. And they'll panic, Julian replied. Because panic means exposure. Renee hesitated. Or retaliation. Julian didn't deny it. Yes. The front door camera chimed again. The woman from earlier stood on the porch once more. This time she wasn't alone. 2 uniformed officers stood a few steps behind her. Neutral expressions. hands resting casually near their belts. Renee's breath caught. Julian? Julian checked the time. They're moving faster. A knock, firmer this time. Mr. Caldwell, the woman called. We need to speak with you. Now. Julian turned to Renee. If they come in, they'll separate us. Ask questions. Twist answers. Renee's voice trembled. What do we do? Julian looked at the laptop on the desk. The flash drive still plugged in. The fail-safe folder open. He met her eyes. We take control. Renee swallowed. Once we do this. There's no undo, Julian finished. I know. The knock came again louder. Julian moved to the desk. His hand hovered over the trackpad. Renee stood beside him, her fingers brushing his. Are you sure? She asked. Julian nodded. I'm done letting them schedule my fear. The knock turned into a pound. Last chance, the woman called. Julian clicked. The screen changed. Failsafe activation. Confirm? A countdown began. 12 hours. Renee stared at the numbers, heart racing. Outside, the pounding stopped. For a moment, everything went eerily quiet. Then Julian's phone rang. A known number. He answered. Yes. Daniel's voice came through, no longer calm. What did you do? Julian didn't answer right away. He watched the countdown on the screen, the numbers glowing with an indifference that felt almost cruel. 12 hours. 11 hours, 59 minutes. Time reduced to a weapon. What I should have done years ago, Julian said finally. On the other end of the line, Daniel exhaled sharply. The sound carried tension now, stripped of polish. You don't understand what you've set in motion, Daniel said. Julian glanced at Renee. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. I understand exactly enough. Daniel's voice hardened. You've activated a system that doesn't distinguish between targets and collateral. That's rich, Julian replied. Coming from someone who specialized in collateral. Silence. Then a quieter voice. Controlled again but thinner. You have 12 hours to reverse it. Julian shook his head, though Daniel couldn't see it. That's not how failsafes work. You know that. Renee leaned closer, her voice calm but sharp. You said disappearing was easier when someone was invisible. You forgot what happens when they aren't. Daniel's pause was longer this time. You were supposed to survive quietly, he said. That was the agreement. I never agreed, Renee replied. You decided. Julian could almost hear Daniel recalculating. If this goes public, you'll lose control of the narrative. People will draw conclusions that aren't precise. Julian scoffed. You're worried about precision now? Daniel ignored the jab. We can contain this. There are ways to redirect. To frame it as misconduct by individuals, not systems. Julian's voice dropped. You mean scapegoats? Damage control, Daniel corrected. Renee's jaw tightened. Like Devon? The name landed like a crack in glass. Daniel didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone had shifted. You're emotional, he said. That makes you vulnerable. Renee stepped closer to the phone. You took everything from me and called it stability. I lived on buses because of you. I slept where people don't look because of you. Julian felt her hand trembling slightly against his arm. You don't get to tell me what vulnerability is, she finished. Daniel's voice sharpened. If this releases, you will not like what follows. Julian nodded to himself. I wouldn't expect to. Another silence. Then Daniel spoke slower. There are people above me who won't negotiate, he said. They will protect themselves. Julian raised an eyebrow. By doing what? Daniel hesitated. By isolating the threat. Julian felt a chill. Meaning us. Yes, Daniel admitted. Which is why I'm calling you, not them. Renee's eyes narrowed. You're scared. Daniel didn't deny it. This was never supposed to escalate, he said. You were meant to stay small. Both of you. Julian's voice was firm. That's your mistake. You assumed small meant weak. The call ended abruptly. No goodbye. No warning. Just silence. Renee let out a shaky breath. That didn't feel like a win. Julian looked back at the countdown. 11 hours, 42 minutes. It wasn't, he said. It was a turning point. Almost immediately his phone lit up again. Not a call this time. An alert. Unusual activity detected on multiple accounts. Renee closed her eyes. Here it comes. Julian moved quickly, opening another laptop. He logged into systems most people didn't know existed. Backup funds. Trusts structured to trigger automatically under legal review. They're freezing liquidity, he said. But not everything. Renee watched him, surprised. You planned for this? Julian gave a grim smile. I planned for greed. I didn't plan for conscience. The front door camera chimed again. This time no clipboard. No uniforms. 3 men stood outside. Dark jackets. Earpieces. Julian's pulse quickened. That's not the city. Renee's voice was steady. That's private. The men didn't knock. One of them spoke into his sleeve, eyes fixed on the door. Julian shut the laptop. We're not answering. Renee nodded. They don't need us to. A low hum filled the house. The lights flickered again, longer this time. They're testing boundaries, Julian said. Seeing how far they can go without consequences. Renee swallowed. What if they don't wait 12 hours? Julian met her gaze. Then they exposed themselves. He pulled up the fail-safe dashboard again. A new indicator blinked red. External interference detected. Renee's breath caught. They're trying to stop it. Julian's fingers flew over the keys. They can't. It's mirrored across independent servers. Cutting one triggers another. Outside, one of the men raised his hand. The other stepped back. Julian's phone buzzed again. A message this time. Unknown number. You think exposure makes you safe? It doesn't. It just changes the rules. Renee read it over his shoulder. They're getting desperate. Julian nodded. Desperate people make mistakes. The house went dark. Complete blackout. Renee gasped. Julian. Emergency lights flickered on seconds later, casting the room in a dim amber glow. Julian exhaled. Backup generator. Outside, the men froze, clearly not expecting that. Renee felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking. She was standing in the middle of the storm. Julian checked the timer again. 10 hours, 58 minutes. The countdown continued. And somewhere beyond the walls, powerful people were realizing they had misjudged how dangerous it was to corner 2 people who had nothing left to hide. Morning came without softness. No sunrise through open curtains. No sense of relief. Just a gradual thinning of darkness, like the world reluctantly admitting another day. Renee sat on the floor with her back against the couch, wrapped in a blanket she didn't remember grabbing. The emergency lights hummed faintly. The house felt suspended, like it was holding its breath. Julian hadn't slept at all. He stood at the kitchen island, laptop open, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, precise sentences. Not pleading. Not panicking. Coordinating. Yes, that account too. No, don't move it yet. Wait for confirmation. When he finally ended the call, he looked older. Not weakened. Sharpened. How much time? Renee asked. Julian checked the screen. 6 hours and 12 minutes. Her chest tightened. They haven't stopped trying. No, he said. But they've changed tactics. She waited. They're leaking partial stories, Julian continued. Anonymous tips. Fragments meant to confuse. If the full release hits now, they'll claim it's retaliation. Renee closed her eyes. They're poisoning the well. Yes. Julian's jaw clenched. Which means they're scared of what's actually in it. The front gate camera flickered on automatically. A delivery truck rolled past, slowed, then kept going. No one got out. Renee watched the feed. They're watching without touching. Because touching leaves fingerprints, Julian said. His phone buzzed again. A new email this time. From a journalist. Subject. Need confirmation before publication. Julian opened it, read silently, then turned the screen toward Renee. They have pieces already, she said. Yes, Julian replied. But not the spine. Renee swallowed. Once the spine is out, there's no controlling the shape. Julian nodded. Truth is messy. That's the risk. Renee pushed herself to her feet, moving slowly but deliberately. I want to see it again. Julian hesitated. Are you sure? I lived it, she said. I deserve to know exactly what they buried. He reopened the flash drive. This time Renee leaned in. They didn't read everything. They didn't need to. They saw enough. Internal messages that referred to people as assets and liabilities. Payments disguised as consulting fees. A memo recommending non-judicial resolution for a domestic exposure. Renee's hands shook. That's me, she whispered. Julian's voice was tight. That's a system deciding your life was inconvenient. She scrolled further, then froze. Julian, she said quietly. He leaned closer. A familiar date stared back at them. The day Devon disappeared. Renee's breath hitched. They were tracking him. Julian read the lines carefully. His face hardened. He wasn't an accident, Julian said. Renee covered her mouth, tears spilling silently now. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the kind that come when something awful finally has a name. They knew, she whispered. They knew he wouldn't stop asking questions. Julian closed the laptop gently, like shutting a door on a body. They didn't just erase him, Renee said. They decided he was expendable. Julian knelt in front of her. I'm so sorry. She shook her head. Don't apologize for seeing it. Apologize if we let it stay buried. Julian stood again, decision settling in his posture. We release early, he said. Renee looked up sharply. The timer? Is leverage, Julian said. But control belongs to whoever moves first. Her heart raced. If we do this now, they can't rewrite what's already everywhere, Julian finished. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Not polite. Not procedural. Both of them froze. The security feed switched automatically. The three men were back. This time they weren't pretending. One of them held up a badge. Not local. Not clear. Renee felt her pulse in her throat. They're done waiting. Julian checked the locks. All secure. For now. His phone rang. Daniel. Julian answered, putting it on speaker. You're making a mistake, Daniel said immediately. His voice was tight now, stripped of its calm. Julian didn't respond. They're moving in, Daniel continued. Not to negotiate. Renee stepped closer to the phone. You said exposure changes the rules. Yes, Daniel snapped. And now you've forced people who don't play by them. Julian's eyes flicked to the laptop. To the cursor hovering over release now. Then watch carefully, Julian said. This is what happens when people you tried to erase refuse to disappear. Renee's hand rested lightly on his arm. She nodded. Julian clicked. The screen flashed. Distribution initiated. Emails sent. Files uploaded. Mirrors activated. Outside, one of the men lifted a hand again. But this time his phone rang. Then another. Confusion rippled through them, subtle but visible. Inside, Renee felt something break free in her chest. Not fear. Relief. Daniel's voice came through the speaker, low and stunned. What did you do? Julian answered calmly. I told the truth. The call disconnected. Sirens sounded in the distance. Not close yet, but moving. Renee sank onto the couch, breath shaking. It's out, she said. Julian nodded. And it can't be pulled back. The house felt different now. Still tense. Still exposed. But no longer silent. Renee looked at the security feed again. The men were backing away. Not retreating. Recalculating. And for the first time since she'd been found in that alley, Renee felt something unfamiliar settle over her. Not safety, but visibility. And that, she realized, was power. 6 hours remained on the original countdown. But it no longer mattered. Because the ending had already begun. The sirens never came closer. They circled instead, distant but constant, like the city itself had shifted into a higher state of alert. News vans replaced sedans. Phones rang unanswered. The quiet pressure that had followed Renee for years cracked into something louder and harder to contain. By noon, the first headline broke. Not sensational. Careful. Verified. By evening there were more. Investigative pieces layered over each other, each one filling gaps the last couldn't reach. Names were printed. Financial paths mapped. Screenshots included. The kind of reporting that didn't speculate, it demonstrated. Julian watched it unfold from the same kitchen island where fear had once stacked itself into notifications. Now the alerts were different. Board members resigning. Emergency meetings canceled. Law firms issuing statements that said nothing and admitted everything. "They're cutting loose," Renee said softly. Julian nodded. Survival instinct. The black sedan across the street never came back. Neither did Daniel. Instead, two unfamiliar cars appeared the next morning. Government plates. No intimidation. No urgency. Just process. Renee answered questions slowly, carefully. Not because she was afraid, but because she was finally being listened to. Her voice didn't shake when she spoke about the apartment, the eviction, the shelters. It tightened when Devon's name came up, but it didn't disappear. Julian sat beside her through all of it. Not interrupting. Not rescuing. Just present. That mattered more than he'd expected. When it was over, the house felt strangely empty. Not abandoned. Just quiet in a way it hadn't been since before the alley, before the call, before the countdown. Renee stood at the window again, but this time she wasn't scanning for danger. "They didn't win," she said. Julian joined her. "No. But they didn't lose cleanly either." She nodded. "They never do. There were consequences." Julian stepped down from his position before he was asked to. The company survived, reshaped and publicly audited, but the name no longer meant what it used to. Some investors walked away. Others stayed out of obligation. Julian didn't mind. For the first time in years, his calendar had space in it. Renee moved slowly after that. Not backward. Not forward in a straight line. Just carefully. She met with advocates. Then with a counselor. She spoke once at a closed-door hearing and declined every invitation after. "I don't want to be a symbol," she said. "I just want to be a person." Julian understood. They didn't define what they were to each other right away. They shared meals. Walked short distances. Let silence exist without explaining it. One afternoon, months later, Julian drove past the alley. It was cleaner now. Painted over. Still narrow. Still forgotten by most people. He didn't stop. That night, Renee sat across from him at the small dining table. She held a mug with both hands like warmth was something to be earned. "I used to think being seen was dangerous," she said. "That disappearing was safer." Julian listened. "But disappearing is what let them decide my life," she continued. "Visibility didn't fix everything. It didn't bring Devon back. It didn't undo the years." She looked up at him. "But it stopped them from choosing for me." Julian nodded. "That's more than most people get." She smiled faintly. A real one this time. The story didn't end with applause or redemption packaged neatly in headlines. Some of the people responsible were prosecuted. Others retired quietly. Systems adjusted just enough to survive. Life went on. But Renee no longer slept curled inward, bracing for the world. And Julian no longer believed wealth was insulation. What saved them wasn't money or power or even exposure. It was refusal. Refusal to stay quiet. Refusal to stay small. Refusal to let fear masquerade as protection. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or think or feel something uncomfortable, consider staying connected. Stories like this don't matter unless they're heard, shared, and remembered. And sometimes, the simple act of listening is what keeps someone from disappearing.